A frown passed over Harris's countenance. "I know very little about the coast," he answered, "but I know enough to assure you that there is no town to the north within 300 or 400 miles. "Then why should we not go south?" persisted Dick. "You would then have to travel to Chile, which is almost as far, and under your circumstances, I should not advise you to skirt the pampas of the Argentine Republic. For my own part, I could not accompany you." "But do not the vessels which ply between Chile and Peru come within sight of this coast?" interposed Mrs. Weldon. "No, madam, they keep out so far to sea that there would not be the faintest chance of your hailing one." "You seem to have another question to ask Mr. Harris," Mrs. Weldon continued, addressing Dick, who still looked rather doubtful. Dick replied that he was about to inquire at what port he would be likely to find a ship to convey their party to San Francisco. "That I really cannot tell you, my young friend," rejoined Harris. "I can only repeat my promise that we will furnish you with the means of conveyance from San Felice to Atacama, where no doubt you will obtain all the information you require." "I hope you will not think that Dick is insensible to your kindness, Mr. Harris," said Mrs. Weldon, apologetically. "On the contrary," promptly observed Dick. "I fully appreciate it. I only wish we had been cast ashore upon a spot where we should have had no need to intrude upon his generosity." "I assure you, madam, it gives me unbounded pleasure to serve you in any way," said Harris. "It is, as I have told you, not often that I come in contact with any of my own countrymen." "Then we accept your offer as frankly as it is made," replied the lady, adding, "but I cannot consent to deprive you of your horse. I am a very good walker." "So am I," said Harris with a bow, "and consequently I intend you and your little son to ride. I am used to long tramps through the pampas. Besides, it is not at all unlikely that we shall come across some of the workpeople belonging to the hacienda. If so, they will be able to give us a mount." Convinced that it would only be thwarting Mrs. Weldon's wishes to throw any further impediment in the way, Dick Sands suppressed his desire to raise fresh obstacles, and simply asked how soon they ought to start. "This very day at once," said Harris quickly. "So soon?" asked Dick. "Yes, the rainy season begins in April, and the sooner we are at San Felice the better. The way through the forest is the safest as well as the shortest, for we shall be less likely to meet any of the nomad Indians, who are notorious robbers." Without making any direct reply, Dick proceeded to instruct the Negroes to choose such of the provisions as were most easy of transport, and to make them up into packages, that every one might carry a due share. Hercules, with his usual good nature, professed himself willing to carry the entire load, a proposal, however, to which Dick would not listen for a moment. "You are a fine fellow, Hercules," said Harris, scrutinizing the giant with the eye of a connoisseur. "You would be worth something in the African market." "Those who want me now must catch me first," retorted Hercules with a grin. The services of all hands were enlisted, and in a comparatively short time, sufficient food was packed up to supply the party for about 10 days' march. "You must allow us to show you what hospitality is in our power," said Mrs. Weldon, addressing her new acquaintance. "Our breakfast will be ready in a quarter of an hour, and we shall be happy if you will join us." "It will give me much pleasure," answered Harris gaily. "I will employ the interval in fetching my horse, who has breakfasted already." "I will accompany you," said Dick. "By all means, my young friend, come with me, and I will show you the lower part of the river." While they were gone, Hercules was sent in search of Cousin Benedict, who was wandering on the top of the cliff in quest of some wonderful insect, which, of course, was not to be found. Without asking his permission, Hercules unceremoniously brought him back to Mrs. Weldon, who explained how they were about to start upon a 10 days' march into the interior of the country. The entomologist was quite satisfied with the arrangement, and declared himself ready for a march across the entire continent, as long as he was free to be adding to his collection on the way. Thus assured of her cousin's acquiescence in her plans, Mrs. Weldon proceeded to prepare such a substantial meal as she hoped would invigorate them all for the approaching journey. Harris and Dick Sands, meantime, had turned the corner of the cliff and walked about 300 paces along the shore until they came to a tree to which a horse was tethered. The creature neighed as it recognized its master. It was a strong-built animal, of a kind that Dick had not seen. Illustration: they came to a tree to which a horse was tethered. Before, although its long neck and crupper, short loins, flat shoulders and arched forehead indicated that it was of Arabian breed. Plenty of strength here, Harris said, as after unfastening the horse, he took it by the bridle and began to lead it along the shore. Dick made no reply. He was casting a hasty glance at the forest which enclosed them on either hand. It was an unattractive sight, but he observed nothing to give him any particular ground for uneasiness. Turning round, he said abruptly, "Did you meet a Portuguese last night, named Negoro?" "Negoro? Who is Negoro?" asked Harris in a tone of surprise. "He was our ship's cook, but he has disappeared." "Drowned probably," said Harris indifferently. "No, he was not drowned. He was with us during the evening, but left afterwards. I thought perhaps you might have met him along the riverside as you came that way." "No," said Harris, "I saw no one. If your cook ventured alone into the forest, most likely he has lost his way. It is possible we may pick him up upon our road." When they arrived at the grotto, they found breakfast duly prepared. Like the supper of the previous evening, it consisted mainly of corned beef and biscuit. Harris did ample justice to the repast. "There is no fear of our starving as we go," he observed to Mrs. Weldon. "But I can hardly say so much for the unfortunate Portuguese, your cook, of whom my young friend here has been speaking." "Ah, has Dick been telling you about Negoro?" Mrs. Weldon said. Dick explained that he had been inquiring whether Mr. Harris had happened to meet him in the direction he had come. "I saw nothing of him," Harris repeated, "and as he has deserted you, you need not give yourselves any concern about him." And apparently glad to turn the subject, he said, "Now, madam, I am at your service. Shall we start at once?" It was agreed that there was no cause for delay. Each one took up the package that had been assigned him. Mrs. Weldon, with Hercules' help, mounted the horse, and Jack, with his miniature gun slung across his shoulder, was placed astride in front of her. Without a thought of acknowledging the kindness of the good-natured stranger in providing him so enjoyable a ride, the heedless little fellow declared himself quite capable of guiding the gentleman's horse. And when to indulge him the bridle was put into his hand, he looked as proud as though he had been appointed leader of the whole caravan. Chapter 16. Through the forest. Although there was no obvious cause for apprehension, it cannot be denied that it was with a certain degree of foreboding that Dick Sands first entered that dense forest, through which for the next 10 days they were all to wend their toilsome way. Mrs. Weldon, on the contrary, was full of confidence and hope. A woman and a mother, she might have been expected to be conscious of anxiety at the peril to which she might be exposing herself and her child, and doubtless she would have been sensible of alarm if her mind had not been fully satisfied upon 2 points. First, that the portion of the pampas they were about to traverse was little infested either by natives or by dangerous beasts, and secondly, that she was under the protection of a guide so trustworthy as she believed Harris to be. The entrance to the forest was hardly more than 300 paces up the river. An order of march had been arranged which was to be observed as closely as possible throughout the journey. At the head of the troop were Harris and Dick Sands, one armed with his long gun, the other with his Remington. Next came Bat and Austin, each carrying a gun and a cutlass. Then Mrs. Weldon and Jack on horseback, closely followed by Tom and Old Nan, while Act Aeon with the 4th Remington, and Hercules with a huge hatchet in his waist-belt, brought up the rear. Dingo had no especial place in the procession, but wandered to and fro at his pleasure. Ever since he had been cast ashore, Dick had noticed a remarkable change in the dog's behavior. The animal was in a constant state of agitation, always apparently on the search for some lost scent, and repeatedly giving vent to a low growl, which seemed to proceed from grief rather than from rage. As for Cousin Benedict, his movements were permitted to be nearly as erratic as Dingo's. Nothing but a leading string could possibly have kept him in the ranks. With his tin box under his arm, and his butterfly net in his hand, and his huge magnifying glass suspended from his neck, he would be sometimes far ahead, sometimes a long way behind, and at the risk of being attacked by some venomous snake, would make frantic dashes into the tall grass whenever he espied some attractive orthoptera or other insect which he thought might be honored by a place in his collection. In 1 hour after starting, Mrs. Weldon had called to him a dozen times without the slightest effect. At last she told him seriously that if he would not give up chasing the insects at a distance, she should be obliged to take possession of his tin box. "Take away my box," he cried, with as much horror as if she had threatened to tear out his vitals. "Yes, your box and your net too." "My box and my net, but surely not my spectacles," almost shrieked the excited entomologist. "Yes, and your spectacles as well," added Mrs. Weldon mercilessly. "I am glad you have reminded me of another means of reducing you to obedience." The triple penalty of which he was thus warned had the effect of keeping him from wandering away for the best part of the next hour, but he was soon once more missing from the ranks. He was manifestly incorrigible. The deprivation of box, net, and spectacles would, it was acknowledged, be utterly without avail to prevent him from rambling. Accordingly, it was thought better to let him have his own way, especially as Hercules volunteered to keep his eye upon him, and to endeavor to guard the worthy naturalist as carefully as he would himself protect some precious. Illustration: the way across the forest could scarcely be called a path. Specimen of a Lepidoptera. Further anxiety on his account was thus put to rest. In spite of Harris's confident assertion that they were little likely to be molested by any of the nomad Indians, the whole company rejoiced in feeling that they were well armed, and they resolved to keep in a compact body. The way across the forest could scarcely be called a path. It was, in fact, little more than the track of animals, and progress along it was necessarily very slow. Indeed, it seemed impossible, at the rate they started, to accomplish more than 5 or 6 miles in the course of 12 hours. The weather was beautifully fine. The sun ascended nearly to the zenith, and its rays, descending almost perpendicularly, caused a degree of heat which, as Harris pointed out, would have been unendurable upon the open plain, but was here pleasantly tempered by the shelter of the foliage. Most of the trees were quite strange to them. To an experienced eye they were such as were remarkable more for their character than for their size. Here on one side was the bauhinia or mountain ebony, there on the other the malampi or pterocarpus, its trunk exuding large quantities of resin, and of which the strong light wood makes excellent oars or paddles. Further on were fustics heavily charged with coloring matter, and guaiacums, 12 feet in diameter, surpassing the ordinary kind in magnitude, yet far inferior in quality. Dick Sands kept perpetually asking Harris to tell him the names of all these trees and plants. "Have you never been on the coast of South America before?" replied Harris, without giving the explicit information that was sought. "Never," said Dick. "Never before, nor do I recollect ever having seen anyone who has." "But surely you have explored the coasts of Colombia or Patagonia," Harris continued. Dick avowed that he had never had the chance. "But has Mrs. Weldon never visited these parts? Our countrymen, I know, are great travelers." "No," answered Mrs. Weldon. "My husband's business called him occasionally to New Zealand, but I have accompanied him nowhere else. With this part of Lower Bolivia, we are totally unacquainted." "Then, madam, I can only assure you that you will see a most remarkable country, in every way a very striking contrast to the regions of Peru, Brazil, and the Argentine Republic. Its animal and vegetable products would fill a naturalist with unbounded wonder. May I not declare it a lucky chance that has brought you here?" "Do not say chance, Mr. Harris, if you please." "Well then, madam, Providence, if you prefer it," said Harris, with the air of a man incapable of recognizing the distinction. After finding that there was no one amongst them who was acquainted in any way with the country through which they were traveling, Harris seemed to exhibit an evident pleasure in pointing out and describing by name the various wonders of the forest. Had Cousin Benedict's attainments included a knowledge of botany, he would have found himself in a fine field for researches, and might perchance have discovered novelties to which his own name could be appended in the catalogues of science. But he was no botanist. In fact, as a rule, he held all blossoms in aversion, on the ground that they entrapped insects into their corollae and poisoned them sometimes with venomous juices. New and rare insects, however, seemed hereabouts to be wanting. Occasionally the soil became marshy, and they all had to wend their way over a perfect network of tiny rivulets that were affluents of the river from which they had started. Sometimes these rivulets were so wide that they could not be passed without a long search for some spot where they could be forded. Their banks were all very damp, and in many places abounded with a kind of reed, which Harris called by its proper name of papyrus. As soon as the marshy district had been passed, the forest resumed its original aspect, the footway becoming narrow as ever. Harris pointed out some very fine ebony trees. Illustration: occasionally the soil became marshy, larger than the common sort, and yielding a wood darker and more durable than what is ordinarily seen in the market. There were also more mango trees than might have been expected at this distance from the sea. A beautiful white lichen enveloped their trunks like a fur. But in spite of their luxuriant foliage and delicious fruit, Harris said that there was not a native who would venture to propagate the species, as the superstition of the country is that whoever plants a mango dies. At noon, a halt was made for the purpose of rest and refreshment. During the afternoon, they arrived at some gently rising ground, not the first slopes of hills, but an insulated plateau which appeared to unite mountains and plains. Notwithstanding that the trees were far less crowded and more inclined to grow in detached groups, the numbers of herbaceous plants with which the soil was covered rendered progress no less difficult than it was before. The general aspect of the scene was not unlike an East Indian jungle. Less luxuriant indeed than in the lower valley of the river, the vegetation was far more abundant than that of the temperate zones, either of the old or new continents. Indigo grew in great profusion, and according to Harris's representation, was the most encroaching plant in the whole country. No sooner, he said, was a field left untilled than it was overrun by this parasite, which sprang up with the rank growth of thistles or nettles. One tree which might have been expected to be common in this part of the continent seemed entirely wanting. This was the caoutchouc. Of the various trees from which India rubber is procured, such as the Ficus prinoides, the Castilioa elastica, the Cecropia peltata, the Calliphora utilis, the Camarilla latifolia, and especially the Siphonia elastica, all of which abound in the provinces of South America, not a single specimen was to be seen. Dick had promised to show Jack an India rubber tree, and the child, who had conjured up visions of squeaking dolls, balls, and other toys growing upon its branches, was loud and constant in his expressions of disappointment. "Never mind, my little man," said Harris. "Have patience, and you shall see hundreds of India rubber trees when you get to the hacienda." "And will they be nice and elastic?" asked Jack, whose ideas upon the subject were of the vaguest order. "Oh yes, they will stretch as long as you like," Harris answered, laughing. "But here is something to amuse you," he added, and as he spoke, he gathered a fruit that looked as tempting as a peach. "You are quite sure that it is safe to give it him?" said Mrs. Weldon anxiously. "To satisfy you, madam, I will eat one first myself." The example he set was soon followed by all the rest. The fruit was a mango. That which had been so opportunely discovered was of the sort that ripens in March or April. There is a later kind which ripens in September. With his mouth full of juice, Jack pronounced that it was very nice, but did not seem to be altogether diverted from his sense of disappointment at not coming to an India rubber tree. Evidently the little man thought himself rather injured. "And Dick promised me some hummingbirds too," he murmured. "Plenty of hummingbirds for you when you get to the farm. Lots of them where my brother lives," said Harris. And to say the truth, there was nothing extravagant in the way the child's anticipations had been raised, for in Bolivia hummingbirds are found in great abundance. The Indians, who weave their plumage into all kinds of artistic designs, have bestowed the most poetical epithets upon these gems of the feathered race. They call them rays of the sun, and tresses of the day star. At one time they will describe them as king of flowers, at another as blossoms of heaven-kissing blossoms of earth, or as the jewel that reflects the sunbeam. In fact, their imagination seems to have shaped a suitable distinction for almost every one of the 150 known species of this dazzling little beauty. But however numerous hummingbirds might be expected to be in the Bolivian forest, they proved scarce enough at present, and Jack had to content himself with Harris's representations that they did not like solitude, but would be found plentifully at San Feliz, where they would be heard all day long humming like a spinning wheel. Already, Jack said he longed to be there, a wish that was so unanimously echoed by all the rest, that they resolved that no stoppage should be allowed beyond what was absolutely indispensable. After a time, the forest began to alter its aspect. The trees were even less crowded, opening now and then into wide glades. The soil, cropping up above its carpet of verdure, exhibited veins of rose granite and syenite, like plates of lapis lazuli. On some of the higher ground, the fleshy tubers of the sarsaparilla plant, growing in a hopeless entanglement, made progress a matter of still greater difficulty than in the narrow tracks of the dense forest. At sunset, the travelers found that they had accomplished about 8 miles from their starting point. They could not prognosticate what hardships might be in store for them on future days, but it was certain that the experiences of the first day had been neither eventful nor very fatiguing. It was now unanimously agreed that they should make a halt for the night, and as little was to be apprehended from the attacks either of man or beast, it was considered unnecessary to form anything like a regular encampment. One man on guard, to be relieved every few hours, was presumed to be sufficient. Admirable shelter was offered by an enormous mango, the spreading foliage of which formed a kind of natural veranda, sweeping the ground so thoroughly that anyone who chose could find sleeping quarters in its very branches. Simultaneously with the halting of the party, there was heard a deafening tumult in the upper boughs. The mango was the roosting place of a colony of gray parrots, a noisy, quarrelsome, and rapacious race, of whose true characteristics the specimens seen in confinement in Europe give no true conception. Their screeching and chattering were such a nuisance that Dick Sands wanted to fire a shot into the middle of them, but Harris seriously dissuaded him, urging that the report of firearms would only serve to reveal their own presence, whilst their greatest safety lay in perfect silence. Supper was prepared. There was little need of cooking. The meal, as before, consisted of preserved meat and biscuit. Fresh water, which they flavored with a few drops of rum, was obtained from an adjacent stream which trickled through the grass. By way of dessert, they had an abundance of ripe mangoes, and the only drawback to their general enjoyment was the discordant outcry which the parrots kept up, as it were in protest against the invasion of what they held to be their own rightful domain. It was nearly dark when supper was ended. The evening shade crept slowly upwards to the tops of the trees, which soon stood out in sharp relief against the lighter background of the sky, while the stars, one by one, began to peep. The wind dropped and ceased to murmur through the foliage. To the general relief, the parrots desisted from their clatter, and as nature hushed herself to rest, she seemed to be inviting all her children to follow her example. "Had we not better light a good large fire?" asked Dick. "By no means," said Harris. "The nights are not cold, and under this wide-spreading mango the ground is not likely to be damp. Besides, as I have told you before, our best security consists in our taking care to attract no attention whatever from without." Mrs. Weldon interposed. "It may be true enough that we have nothing to dread from the Indians, but is it certain that there are no dangerous quadrupeds against which we are bound to be upon our guard?" Harris answered, "I can positively assure you, madam, that there are no animals here but such as would be infinitely more afraid of you than you would be of them." "Are there any woods without wild beasts?" asked Jack. "All woods are not alike, my boy," replied Harris. "This wood is a great park. As the Indians say, es como el paraíso, it is like paradise." Jack persisted. "There must be snakes, and lions and tigers." "Ask your mamma, my boy," said Harris, "whether she ever heard of lions and tigers in America." Mrs. Weldon was endeavoring to put her little boy at his ease on this point, when Cousin Benedict interposed, saying that although there were no lions or tigers, there were plenty of jaguars and panthers in the New World. "And won't they kill us?" demanded Jack eagerly, his apprehensions once more aroused. "Kill you?" laughed Harris. "Why, your friend Hercules here could strangle them, 2 at a time, 1 in each hand." "But please don't let the panthers come near me," pleaded Jack, evidently alarmed. "No, no, Master Jack, they shall not come near you. I will give them a good grip first," and the giant displayed his 2 rows of huge white teeth. Dick Sands proposed that it should be the 4 younger Negroes who should be assigned the task of keeping watch during the night, in attendance upon himself. But Act Aeon insisted so strongly upon the necessity of Dick's having his full share of rest, that the others were soon brought to the same conviction, and Dick was obliged to yield. Jack valiantly announced his intention of taking 1 watch, but his sleepy eyelids made it only too plain that he did not know the extent of his own fatigue. "I am sure there are wolves here," he said. "Only such wolves as Dingo would swallow at a mouthful," said Harris. "But I am sure there are wolves," he insisted, repeating the word wolves again and again, until he tumbled off to sleep against the side of old Nan. Mrs. Weldon gave her little son a silent kiss. It was her loving good night. Cousin Benedict was missing. Some little time before, he had slipped away in search of cocuyos, or fireflies, which he had heard were common in South America. Those singular insects emit a bright bluish light from two spots on the side of the thorax, and their colors are so brilliant that they are used as ornaments for ladies' headdresses. Hoping to secure some specimens for his box, Benedict would have wandered to an unlimited distance. But Hercules, faithful to his undertaking, soon discovered him, and heedless of the naturalist's protestations and vociferations, promptly escorted him back to the general rendezvous. Hercules himself was the first to keep watch, but with this exception, the whole party, in another hour, were wrapped in peaceful slumber. Illustration: Hercules himself was the first to keep watch. Chapter 17. Misgivings. Most travelers who have passed a night in a South American forest have been roused from their slumbers by a matinee musicale more fantastic than melodious, performed by monkeys, as their ordinary greeting of the dawn. The yelling, chattering, screeching, howling all unite to form a chorus almost unearthly in its hideousness. Amongst the various specimens of the numerous family of the quadrumana ought to be recognized the little marikina, the saguin with its party-colored face, the gray mora, the skin of which is used by the Indians for covering their gun locks, the sapaju with its singular tuft over the forehead, and most remarkable of all, the gariba, Simia Beelzebul, with its prehensile tail and diabolical countenance. At the first streak of daylight, the senior member, as choragus, will start the keynote in a sonorous baritone, the younger monkeys join in tenor and alto, and the concert begins. But this morning there was no concert at all. There was nothing of the wonted serenade to break the silence of the forest. The shrill notes resulting from the rapid vibration of the hyoid bones of the throat were not to be heard. Indians would have been disappointed and perplexed. They are very fond of the flesh of the gariba when smoked and dried, and they would certainly have missed the chant of the monkey paternosters. But Dick Sands and his companions were unfamiliar with any of these things, and accordingly the singular quietude was to them a matter of no surprise. They all awoke much refreshed by their night's rest, which there had been nothing to disturb. Jack was by no means the latest in opening his eyes, and his first words were addressed to Hercules, asking him whether he had caught a wolf with his teeth. Hercules had to acknowledge that he had tasted nothing all night, and declared himself quite ready for breakfast. The whole party were unanimous in this respect, and after a brief morning prayer, breakfast was expeditiously served by old Nan. The meal was but a repetition of the last evening's supper, but with their appetites sharpened by the fresh forest air, and anxious to fortify themselves for a good day's march, they did not fail to do ample justice to their simple fare. Even Cousin Benedict, for once in his life at least, partook of his food as if it were not utterly a matter of indifference to him, but he grumbled very much at the restraint to which he considered himself subjected. He could not see the good of coming to such a country as this, if he were to be obliged to walk about with his hands in his pockets, and he protested that if Hercules did not leave him alone and permit him to catch fireflies, there would be a bone to pick between them. Hercules did not look very much alarmed at the threat. Mrs. Weldon, however, took him aside, and telling him that she did not wish to deprive the enthusiast entirely of his favorite occupation, instructed him to allow her cousin as much liberty as possible, provided he did not lose sight of him. The morning meal was over, and it was only 7 o'clock when the travelers were once more on their way towards the east, preserving the same marching order as on the day before. The path was still through luxuriant forest. The vegetable kingdom reigned supreme. As the plateau was immediately adjacent to tropical latitudes, the sun's rays during the summer months descended perpendicularly upon the virgin soil, and the vast amount of heat thus obtained combined with the abundant moisture retained in the subsoil, caused vegetation to assume a character which was truly magnificent. Dick Sands could not overcome a certain sense of mystification. Here they were, as Harris told them, in the region of the Pampas, a word which he knew in the Quichna dialect signifies a plain. But he had always read that these plains were characterized by a deficiency alike of water, of trees, and rocks. He had always understood that during the rainy season, thistles spring up in great abundance and grow until they form thickets that are well-nigh impenetrable. He had imagined that the few dwarf trees and prickly shrubs that exist during the summer only stamp the general scene with an aspect of yet more thorough bareness and desolation. But how different was everything to all this! the forest never ceased to stretch away interminably to the horizon. There were no tokens of the rough nakedness that he had expected. Dick seemed to be driven to the conclusion that Harris was right in describing this plateau of Atacama, which he had for his part most firmly believed to be a vast desert between the Andes and the Pacific, as a region that was quite exceptional in its natural features. It was not in Dick's character to keep his reflections to himself. In the course of the morning, he expressed his extreme surprise at finding the Pampas answer so little to his preconceived ideas. "Have I not understood correctly," he said, "that the Pampas is similar to the North American savannas, only less marshy?" Harris replied that such was indeed a correct description of the Pampas of Rio Colorado, and the Llanos of Venezuela and the Orinoco. "But," he continued, "I own I am as much astonished as yourself at the character of this region. I have never crossed the plateau before, and I must confess it is altogether different to what you find beyond the Andes towards the Atlantic." "You don't mean that we are going to cross the Andes?" said Dick, in sudden alarm. Harris smiled. "No, no, indeed. With our limited means of transport, such an undertaking would have been rash in the extreme. We had better have kept to the coast forever rather than incur such a risk. Our destination, San Feliz, is on this side of the range, and in order to reach it, we shall not have to leave the plateau, of which the greatest elevation is but little over 1,500 feet. "And you say," Dick persisted, "that you have really no fear of losing your way in a forest such as this, a forest into which you have never set foot before." "No fear whatever," Harris answered. "So accustomed am I to traveling of this kind that I can steer my way by 1,000 signs revealing themselves in the growth of the trees, and in the composition of the soil, which would never present themselves to your notice. I assure you that I anticipate no difficulties." This conversation was not heard by any of the rest of the party. Harris seemed to speak as frankly as he did fearlessly, and Dick felt that there might be, after all, no just grounds for any of his own misgivings. 5 days passed by, and the 12th of April arrived without any special incident. 9 miles had been the average distance accomplished in a day. Regular periods of rest had been taken, and except that Jack's spirits had somewhat flagged, the fatigue did not seem to have interfered with the general good health of the travelers. First disappointed of his India rubber tree, and then of his humming birds, Jack had inquired about the beautiful parrots which he had been led to expect he should see in this wonderful forest. Where were the bright green macaws? Where were the gaudy aras with their bare white cheeks and pointed tails, which seemed never to light upon the ground? And where, too, were all the brilliant paroquets, with their feathered faces, and indeed the whole variety of those forest chatterers of which the Indians affirm that they speak the language of nations long extinct? It is true that there was no lack of the common gray parrots with crimson tails, but these were no novelty. Jack. Illustration, don't fire. Had seen plenty of them before, for owing to their reputation of being the most clever in mimicry of the Citizen A, they have been domesticated everywhere in both the Old and New Worlds. But Jack's dissatisfaction was nothing compared to Cousin Benedict's. In spite of being allowed to wander away from the rank, he had failed to discover a single insect which was worth the pursuit. Not even a firefly danced at night. Nature seemed to be mocking him, and his ill humor increased accordingly. In this way, the journey was continued for 4 days longer, and on the 16th it was estimated that they must have traveled between 80 and 90 miles northeastwards from the coast. Harris positively asserted that they could not be much more than 20 miles from San Feliz, and that by pushing forwards, they might expect in 8 and 40 hours to find themselves lodged in comfortable quarters. But although they had thus succeeded in traversing this vast tableland, they had not seen one human inhabitant. Dick was more than ever perplexed, and it was a subject of bitter regret to him that they had not stranded upon some more frequented part of the shore, near some village or plantation where Mrs. Weldon might long since have found a suitable refuge. Deserted, however, as the country apparently was by man, it had latterly shown itself much more abundantly tenanted by animals. Many a time a long, plaintive cry was heard, which Harris attributed to the tardigrades or sloths often found in wooded districts, and known by the name of eyes. And in the middle of the dinner halt on this day, a loud hissing suddenly broke upon the air which made Mrs. Weldon start to her feet in alarm. "A serpent," cried Dick, catching up his loaded gun. The Negroes, following Dick's example, were in a moment on the alert. "Don't fire," cried Harris. There was indeed nothing improbable in the supposition that a sucuru, a species of boa, sometimes measuring 40 feet in length, had just moved itself in the long grass at their side. But Harris affirmed that the sucuru never hisses, and declared that the noise had really come from animals of an entirely inoffensive character. "What animals?" asked Dick, always eager for information, which it must be granted Harris seemed always equally anxious to give. "Antelopes," replied Harris. "But hush, not a sound, or you will frighten them away." "Antelopes," cried Dick. "I must see them, I must get close to them." "More easily said than done," answered Harris, shaking his head, but Dick was not to be diverted from his purpose, and gun in hand, crept into the grass. He had not advanced many yards before a herd of about a dozen gazelles, graceful in body, with short, pointed horns, dashed past him like a glowing cloud, and disappeared in the underwood without giving him time to take a shot. "I told you beforehand what you would have to expect," said Harris, as Dick, with a considerable sense of disappointment, returned to the party. Impossible, however, as it had been fairly to scrutinize the antelopes, such was hardly the case with another herd of animals, the identification of which led to a somewhat singular discussion between Harris and the rest. About 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the same day, the travelers were halting for a few moments near an opening in the forest, when 3 or 4 large animals emerged from a thicket about 100 paces ahead and scampered off at full speed. In spite of what Harris had urged, Dick put his gun to his shoulder and was on the very point of firing when Harris knocked the rifle quickly aside. "They were giraffes," shouted Dick. The announcement awakened the curiosity of Jack, who quickly scrambled to his feet upon the saddle on which he was lounging. "My dear Dick," said Mrs. Weldon, "there are no giraffes in America." Illustration: a herd of gazelles dashed past him like a glowing cloud. "Certainly not," cried Harris. "They were not giraffes, they were ostriches which you saw." "Ostriches with 4 legs, that will never do. What do you say, Mrs. Weldon?" Mrs. Weldon replied that she had certainly taken the animals for quadrupeds, and all the Negroes were under the same impression. Laughing heartily, Harris said it was far from an uncommon thing for an inexperienced eye to mistake a large ostrich for a small giraffe. The shape of both was so similar that it often quite escaped observation as to whether the long necks terminated in a beak or a muzzle. Besides, what need of discussion could there be when the fact was established that giraffes are unknown in the New World? The reasoning was plausible enough, and Mrs. Weldon and the Negroes were soon convinced. But Dick was far from satisfied. "I did not know that there was an American ostrich," he again objected. "Oh yes," replied Harris promptly. "There is a species called the nandu, which is very well known here. We shall probably see some more of them." The statement was correct. The nandu is common in the plains of South America and is distinguished from the African ostrich by having 3 toes, all furnished with claws. It is a fine bird, sometimes exceeding 6 feet in height. It has a short beak, and its wings are furnished with blue-gray plumes. Harris appeared well acquainted with the bird and proceeded to give a very precise account of its habits. In concluding his remarks, he again pressed upon Dick his most urgent request that he should abstain from firing upon any animal whatever. It was of the utmost consequence. Dick made no reply. He was silent and thoughtful. Grave doubts had arisen in his mind, and he could neither explain nor dispel them. When the march was resumed on the following day, Harris asserted his conviction that another 24 hours would bring them to the hacienda. "And there, madam," he said, addressing Mrs. Weldon, "we can offer you every essential comfort, though you may not find the luxuries of your own home in San Francisco." Mrs. Weldon repeated her expression of gratitude for the proffered hospitality, owning that she should now be exceedingly glad to reach the farm, as she was anxious about her little son, who appeared to be threatened with the symptoms of incipient fever. Harris could not deny that, although the climate was usually very healthy, it nevertheless did occasionally produce a kind of intermittent fever during March and April. "But nature has provided the proper remedy," said Dick, and perceiving that Harris did not comprehend his meaning, he continued, "Are we not in the region of the quinquinas, the bark of which is notoriously the medicine with which attacks of fever are usually treated? For my part, I am amazed that we have not seen numbers of them already." "Ah, yes, yes, I know what you mean," answered Harris after a moment's hesitation. "They are trees, however, not always easy to find. They rarely grow in groups, and in spite of their large leaves and fragrant red blossom, the Indians themselves often have a difficulty in recognizing them. The feature that distinguishes them most is their evergreen foliage." At Mrs. Weldon's request, Harris promised to point out the tree if he should see one, but added that when she reached the hacienda, she would be able to obtain some sulfate of quinine, which was much more efficacious than the unprepared bark. Footnote: this bark was formerly reduced to powder, known as pulvis jesuiticus, because in the year 1649, the Jesuits in Rome imported a large quantity of it from their missionaries in South America. The day passed without further incident. No rain had fallen at present, though the warm mist that rose from the soil betokened an approaching change of weather. The rainy season was certainly not far distant, but to travelers. Illustration: a halt was made for the night beneath a grove of lofty trees. Who indulged the expectation of being in a few hours in a place of shelter, this was not a matter of great concern. Evening came, and a halt was made for the night beneath a grove of lofty trees. If Harris had not miscalculated, they could hardly be more than about 6 miles from their destination. So confirmed, however, was Dick Sands in his strange suspicions, that nothing could induce him to relax any of the usual precautions, and he particularly insisted upon the negroes, turn by turn, keeping up the accustomed watch. Worn out by fatigue, the little party were glad to lie down, but they had scarcely dropped off to sleep when they were aroused by a sharp cry. "Who's that? Who's there? What's the matter?" exclaimed Dick, the first to rise to his feet. "It is I," answered Benedict's voice. "I am bitten, something has bitten me." "A snake!" exclaimed Mrs. Weldon in alarm. "No, no, cousin, better than that. It was not a snake, I believe it was an orthoptera, I have it all right," he shouted triumphantly. "Then kill it quickly, sir, and let us go to sleep again in peace," said Harris. "Kill it, not for the world. I must have a light and look at it." Dick Sands indulged him, for reasons of his own, in getting a light. The entomologist carefully opened his hand and displayed an insect somewhat smaller than a bee, of a dull color, streaked with yellow on the under portion of the body. He looked radiant with delight. "A diptera," he exclaimed, half beside himself with joy, "a most famous diptera." "Is it venomous?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Not at all to men, it only hurts elephants and buffaloes." "But tell us its name, what is it?" cried Dick impetuously. The naturalist began to speak in a slow, oracular tone. "This insect is here a prodigy. It is an insect totally unknown in this country, in America." "Tell us its name," roared Dick. "It is a tsetse, sir, a true tsetse." Dick's heart sank like a stone, he was speechless. He did not, dared not, ask more. Only too well he knew where the tsetse could alone be found. He did not close his eyes again that night. Chapter 18. A terrible discovery. The morning of the 18th dawned, the day on which, according to Harris's prediction, the travelers were to be safely housed at San Felice. Mrs. Weldon was really much relieved at the prospect, for she was aware that her strength must prove inadequate to the strain of a more protracted journey. The condition of her little boy, who was alternately flushed with fever and pale with exhaustion, had begun to cause her great anxiety, and unwilling to resign the care of the child even to Nan, his faithful nurse, she insisted upon carrying him in her own arms. 12 days and nights, passed in the open air, had done much to try her powers of endurance, and the charge of a sick child in addition would soon break down her strength entirely. Dick Sands, Nan, and the Negroes had all borne the march very fairly. Their stock of provisions, though of course considerably diminished, was still far from small. As for Harris, he had shown himself preeminently adapted for forest life, and capable of bearing any amount of fatigue. Yet, strange to say, as he approached the end of the journey, his manner underwent a remarkable change. Instead of conversing in his ordinary frank and easy way, he became silent and preoccupied, as if engrossed in his own thoughts. Perhaps he had an instinctive consciousness that his young friend, as he was in the habit of addressing Dick, was entertaining hard suspicions about him. The march was resumed. The trees once again ceased to be crowded in impenetrable masses, but stood in clusters at considerable distances apart. Now, Dick tried to argue with himself, they must be coming to the true pampas, or the man must be designedly misleading them, and yet what motive could he have? Although during the earlier part of the day, there occurred nothing that could be said absolutely to justify Dick's increasing uneasiness, two circumstances transpired which did not escape his observation, and which, he felt, might be significant. The first of these was a sudden change in Dingo's behavior. The dog, throughout the march, had uniformly run along with his nose upon the ground, smelling the grass and shrubs, and occasionally uttering a sad low whine. But today he seemed all agitation. He scampered about with bristling coat, with his head erect, and ever and again burst into one of those furious fits of barking, with which he had formerly been accustomed to greet Negoro's appearance upon the deck of the Pilgrim. The idea that flitted across Dick's mind was shared by Tom. "Look, Mr. Dick, look at Dingo, he is at his old ways again," said he. "It is just as if Negoro—" "Hush," said Dick to the old man, who continued in a lower voice.